I'm Alice Thorneycroft, and this is Brilliant Minds in Conversation, the podcast series where we untap the insights and stories from individuals who've performed at the very top of their careers. And our guest today is a man shaped by a journey to the very edge and back. In an attempt to row the Atlantic in one of the toughest races on Earth, Max Thorpe was struck by a devastating rogue wave. The events that followed are widely regarded as some of the most perilous in the history of ocean sport. Undeterred, he returned just 2 years later to win the race and set a new world record. The central tenet of his experience, resilience, now defines his professional life. Max leads the expedition division of British brand Shackleton and is co-founder of training and development consultancy Rogue Wave Scenarios. Please welcome Max Thorpe. Max, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here. And I will just say for all our listeners and viewers, I met Max, a couple of months ago. And I always had this kind of weird feeling when I met you, Max, that I was meeting the actor playing you in the story. I mean, the story, guys, is unreal. So that won't make any sense to you right now. But by the end of this podcast, that will become very clear.
Doesn't really make sense to me either, but, yeah.
So, Max, I'd love to start to get to know the little Max, the young Max, who you were and where you grew up. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. I was someone, I had a very fortunate upbringing, very lucky to have an incredibly loving, caring, supportive family. I'm the middle child of two sisters. So that's probably shaped a lot of who I am. And I think, largely defined my childhood as a very sporty individual. I think, everyone has specific things in their upbringing that really sculpt them and define their characteristics and their kind of traits and values. And certainly I was out on the sports field, 6-7 times a week, playing a variety of different sports. And that's where, I certainly felt like I thrived. And so I think that, that was certainly a core part of making me, I guess, who I was in those early years.
What sports?
So, growing up, I'd say, the early years. So when I was probably 3 or 4, I was, my parents were probably trying to get me to swim. So that was the first thing I was doing. I was playing a lot of tennis, a lot of football, up till about the age of 10 or 11. Continued all those things, but then started playing more cricket, rugby, and some, mainly kind of those, I guess, 5 were my headline sports that I was playing throughout sort of school, I suppose. Fantastic.
And then from school, did you take a kind of traditional path? Did you go to a university? What did you do?
It was a traditional to a point. So yeah, absolutely. I was sort of into the system of, I was always expected to go to university. I struggled a little bit with moving from school to university. It wasn't as smooth as I would have liked it to be. I initially went to a university that I sort of deferred my place to and kind of dropped out just off the back of leaving school, and just didn't feel like I was really ready to sort of move on to more academics and more deadlines and things like that in my life. So I took a year out and then went back to university. I went to University of Nottingham. So I was there for 3 years. I studied politics, which is totally just not something that really defines me now, but it was something that I felt was relevant at the time. I think relatively enjoyed time at university and certainly loved my time at school.
And what did you do following university?
Yeah, so following university, I had a lot of my peers that were continuing on a path which had probably been defined for them for quite a long period of time. I often kind of make the comparison between myself and my older sister, who so my dad's a doctor, and she said she wanted to be a doctor when she put his stethoscope around her neck, I think at the age of 2, and so she is now a doctor, and that was her path, and it was never it was always a guarantee really in the eyes of all of us. Mine was a little bit more complex in terms of what I wanted to do and what I felt would define my life kind of beyond school and university. And I think at university, speaking about all those things that we were speaking about shortly about kind of sport and how that defined my sort of competitive instinct and those values and the things that really made me me. Certainly at university, I lost that. I didn't really play much sport. And I sort of got lost in I guess probably more in the social scene of university, and sort of just didn't commit to continuing with my pursuits in the sporting world, which was, probably actually one of few regrets I have of sort of not pushing that forward. But ultimately it did spark something in me that kind of did define my post-university life, because it was whilst I was at university that I felt like I needed a change and a goal in my life that could re-engage that competitiveness, re-engage the facets of who I was growing up, that really sort of propelled me forward and inspired me and had me kind of striving for progress and all those things. And so I was looking for a big challenge to essentially to engage those things, and quite unglamorously discovered the world of ocean rowing.
How did you?
It's not a sort of a
mainstream sport.
It's not a wild story either. It's not mainstream at all. It was in those days. It was 2015. It was still quite a young sport. I mean, it still is today, but I kind of stumbled across it quite literally looking at what are the biggest challenges on Earth. And as soon as I discovered ocean rowing, for me, just all the details, all the sort of different dynamics and all the things that you have to sort of do in order to just get to the start of one of these races across an ocean. For me, it was just a challenge which really just felt like it had all the elements that would push me to be someone who I felt like I was deep down, but wasn't sort of displaying to the world really, and to myself. So,
and to be clear, you hadn't rowed in the past.
No, I wasn't a rower. I was, my rowing experience was quite limited to the kind of rowing machine in the gym. So that was, I guess that was a steep learning curve that I knew I'd have to, I'd have to take on. But that was part of the attraction. I think likewise with time at sea, I wasn't someone that had spent a huge amount of time on the ocean. My dad was a relatively keen sailor. His dad was a very keen sailor, but it ultimately didn't really translate all the way down to me. But I had always been fascinated by the ocean, I suppose, and so the thought of both those learning curves, so both the rowing, but also becoming someone who was adept in the ocean, were two parts of the attraction. I think those steep learning curves was something that was sort of lit something within me that that would be an exciting journey to go on.
And so this was a time when you'd left university, you were presumably working at this point, and your peer group were kind of on that trajectory, with the kind of normal trajectory, and yet you are thinking about taking on this incredible challenge. So how did you make it work? What were you doing day to day?
Yeah, I think just trying to preparing for this challenge in isolation, to row an ocean is a huge undertaking. You've obviously got all of the technical learning, you've got to procure all the equipment, you've got to fundraise, and I've often described it's like launching a startup really, and alongside that you're then training at the level of a sort of Olympic athlete, trying to be as fit and strong as I had ever been, and then also alongside that you're trying to sort of run a full-time job as well. So it's incredibly busy time in my life for sure.
What were you doing for work?
So out of university, I moved into work in the sort of consulting world. So I worked as an analyst for a range of different businesses that required kind of strategic support. So it was actually a fantastic setup for me coming out of university with the row campaign running, because it gave me some flexibility around the projects that I took on, and it did allow me a few gaps to kind of go all in on sort of row prep. So yeah, there's a combination of all those things. In terms of managing that, it's obviously any big challenge, you are making sacrifices, and they're incredibly selfish undertakings. I do genuinely believe that. And, it's very much about yourself and getting yourself in the right headspace, and making sure that you're doing everything you can to be the best you can be for the goal that you're trying to achieve. And that often means that you won't be the best for other people. So, that's just something you have to kind of accept. And those around you, if you're lucky enough to have that supporting network, they'll support you on that. But it's certainly a big challenge to sort of juggle all those things. And, but I think I was just so laser focused on this incredible feeling I had about this challenge. And, I didn't mention that the first thing I saw about the Atlantic row, which is this thing that really sort of caught my eye, was someone who had completed the row standing on their ocean rowing boat with a flare above their head, having just crossed the finish line of this incredible race across the Atlantic Ocean, and the finish line being in Antigua. And that image just lit a fire in me, and I just had to feel what that was like. I couldn't really think what that would feel like to be at sea for months on end and be sort of battling the ocean and yourself in many ways for that amount of time, and then to feel like you've completed that journey. Just for me, that was this feeling deep down, this instinct that I had, that that was what was driving me forward through this period for sure.
And had you ever had a feeling like that before when you were growing up? Because if I saw someone holding a flare at the end of an Atlantic race, it wouldn't make me want to go and do it. So what was it about that? What is it about you? Have you ever experienced that feeling before, or was this the first time?
I think it was the first time I really consciously felt like that, following my instinct was an inherent part of really what was defining me. But I certainly think when I look back, retrospectively on my childhood and some of my views and some of the situations and scenarios that I was in growing up, I was following an instinct, and it was impossible for someone someone external, someone around me, to sort of guide me away from that instinct. And often that meant, clashing and conflict, I suppose, in some relationships. But I looking back, it was just because I knew it was something that was right. And it is, my instinct is, there's no doubt in my mind, it's very much that internal compass for me that I will always follow. But the row really became the most powerful example of that for sure.
So you said you've got a close-knit family. So how did you broach this enormous challenge with your mum?
Just with a text to start. Yeah, it's not. It wasn't the right way to kick things off with my mum. Look, I'll admit I'm without a doubt I'm a mummy's boy as well, and so she was the first person I messaged. Quite something to the tone of, "Are you okay if I row across the Atlantic Ocean?" And this must have been about 5 minutes after I discovered this race and this challenge, and she gave me the quickest text response I've ever had. Just 2 letters. She said no, and yeah, immediately I sort of realised there would be something to overcome there, but maybe with time she would hopefully understand and sort of see see that instinct and see that feeling and see that belief that this was the right path for me, which she absolutely did. But yeah, that was it wasn't the best footing to start off on when I was thinking about that support of the family and my mum for sure.
So this is a pairs race. So how did you go about finding your partner?
Yeah, there aren't many people that you would want to spend months on a small 7-meter boat with. Quite literally 24 hours a day. I think that would be quite a tough thing to do for 2 people, just kind of sat in a living room for that amount of time, not being able to leave. But then throw in all the the dynamics that you have at sea with the pressure of the physical strain, the mental strain, and the emotional difficulties that you can encounter. You've got to get that person right, and I knew it was not going to be easy to work out exactly who that would be, but I knew of a few people that I felt like had that physical and mental edge that would align with both my ambition for the race and taking it on, but also just some people that I felt like I had already fantastic relationships with, had already spent some time under pressure with, mostly on the sports field. And I had two kind of really good friends of mine that I had in mind. One of them was on a cricket season in Australia at the time. And his name is Chris Williams. And there was another of my great friends called Dave Spellman, who was in London at the time. And it was Dave who I messaged initially, quite similar to the message I sent to my mum. I was keeping things very direct and to the point. I said, I found this incredible challenge. I definitely want to do it as a pair. And is this something you're interested in? And it did not take Dave long to say yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So you found your partner, you're working, but you're training hard, you're sorting out all the sponsorship, getting to the race. How long did that take you?
Yeah, it's, we certainly underestimated how long it would take. And there's a lot of talk in the ocean racing space, and actually I think in the expedition world in general, that sort of getting yourself to the start of these challenges is actually almost as difficult as the challenge itself, just because of all the detail and all the funding that needs to be raised, and all of that sort of procurement of equipment and everything else that goes into these challenges. And so it was initially going to be a 12-month project. It was certainly in my mind, and we were about 6 months into that project. We were struggling with our sort of fundraising and trying to get people to sort of support us in this endeavor. And we then had our first sort of big hurdle to overcome, which was that Dave was offered a pro rugby contract. And he's been a rugby player all of his life, a fantastic one at that, and this was a bit of a dream for him. And so he describes it as a moment when he did have to pick between two dreams. He was incredibly committed and passionate about achieving the goal of rowing the Atlantic, but ultimately this opportunity presented itself, and I think we both knew that was the right thing for him. And that left me, we kind of parted very amicably on that basis. He was really clear quite early on about the potential of that happening, and when it did, I had time to process, and my mind was straight on to, right, I obviously need to kind of fill that seat on the boat. And as I mentioned earlier, there's only one person else really in the world who I would kind of get on board that boat with, and Chris had just got back from his cricket season. And so the stars sort of aligned, and we met for a catch up, and I knew I was going into that conversation about to pitch something potentially quite life-changing to him. And you could kind of see it on his face immediately that was something he was incredibly keen to join. And I think he actually mentioned at the time that he had some sort of dream a few months before where he knew that I was taking on the road with Dave, but he actually had a dream where he was sort of replacing Dave, which was really strange. But he's a guy that thinks very deeply and considerably about any decision, and I made sure I gave him a few weeks to work that out with his family and friends, and he eventually said yes, and we were kind of full steam towards the start of the challenge.
So when did this challenge happen? What year?
Yeah, so it took us about another year. So we missed the 12-month sort of plan that we had, but very quickly were able to make a guarantee that we would be at the next year's race. So it was essentially 2 years of planning and training in all, and we eventually made the start line of the race in December 2017.
And where does the race start and finish? So
the race starts in La Gomera in the Canaries, small island next to Tenerife. Sort of every December it gets overtaken by these crews from around the world that are coming in with this shared goal of crossing the Atlantic, and becomes an incredible hub and energy for pushing your limits and setting and trying to set and achieve ambitious goals. And there's obviously a lot of support crew that come down as well. So it becomes a very busy place on this island each December. And so to get there, it was an incredible feeling, getting to the start again is, feels like a massive achievement, and you start to realize you've done, a lot of the hard work, a lot of the complex work, and now life becomes actually pretty simple. You are laser focused on the fact that you just want to do everything you can to get across the ocean.
And in my mind, I feel like that start line must be quite interesting from a psychology point of view. Are you sizing each other up? Are you looking at your competitors thinking, oh, I think I might have a little bit of an edge on them? I mean, what's going on?
We certainly were. Yeah, we certainly were. I think, look, everyone has their motivations for big challenges, and everyone also then needs to find things to keep them moving through that challenge and towards that goal. And so for some individuals, it's not about what's going on around you. It's about the personal journey. I think myself and Chris, as two guys that really grew up on sports pitches and in the sports world, that competitive instinct is absolutely a part of us, and we know it's a positive part of us, particularly when you're facing the task of 1 million strokes to cross the Atlantic. And so for us, you need something to keep you pulling on those oars and adding another stroke to that tally. And that was the competitive instinct. That was the competition around us. It was the other crews. So we totally kind of immersed ourselves in those conversations, and I think it was it was something that we really thrived off, was just sizing up the other crews, sort of in discussions with other teams. And a lot of people will start to talk about who they think who's going to win the race. Are there any records potentially going to be broken, and who's best prepared? And so it's sort of quite a bit of fun in La Gomera, but it quickly, when you get out in the ocean, it quickly becomes absolutely a key part of motivating you in your next shift, and your next pull on those oars, for sure.
And now, if I'm not mistaken, the actual race start date was pushed back a bit because of the weather at the time, was it not?
Absolutely, yeah. So this is something that doesn't happen every year, but they're very careful, the race, about when they release the crews into the Atlantic, because of the kind of the currents and the ocean around the Canaries, especially when you don't have a motor or a sail. If the wind is temperamental, you're going to end up in a potential situation where you're caught in the Canaries or even get out into the open ocean. So they're very careful about when they let you go. And we went down for our race start on the 12th of December, raring to go, pretty much packed up at our villa, coming down as if this was going to be our final walk down to the harbour before we were crossing the start line. And they sat us all down and said, look, these conditions are too bad to let you go today. We're going to push it back at least 48 hours. And that was the first indication to us that it was one of those years weather-wise that was going to be fast. It was going to be quite chaotic, and it was going to be a big challenge. And because big winds means big seas, and that means fast ocean rowing boats. But it also means that all the adaptations that you need to make into a routine and a pattern of life in the ocean becomes so much harder. But I think more than anything, everyone was sort of quite fired up by the fact that the adrenaline was pumping. Okay, we're going to get big seas. We're gonna experience some pretty heavy conditions, and there's potential for some records to be kind of on the line.
Little did you know, hey Max. So listen, tell us, 48 hours later, when you were released into the ocean, tell us your incredible story. Yeah,
so we eventually did get led across that start line on the 14th of December, so a few days later. Still, pretty howling winds. I remember looking up at the flags around the harbour, and they were being blown pretty hard. And the start day is an incredible day. It's an incredible moment, and it is the moment that everyone's been thinking about for years. And huge support comes down to kind of wish you well and see you off, wave you off. There's an image of us coming across the start line, and we've both got big smiles on our faces. So there's a sense of excitement around what's ahead. Probably quite a bit of ignorance as well. But we came across that start line. There's a sign that says 3,000 miles to go right next to you, and that's sort of the last thing you look at before kind of get your head down and heave on the oars and get you released out of the marina and into the ocean. So it's a staggered start, and so all the boats sort of head out, and it's incredible how quickly all those boats disappear, and you can no longer really see anyone else. You see obviously the islands around you, but very quickly as well, those sort of drift off into the distance on that first day. And we were really thrown into a total baptism of fire in the Atlantic. We had training rows off the coast of the UK. I guess the thing that you worry about most there are probably dodging, cruise ships and ferries more than huge waves and winds. And so, this was totally new, and we were having to absolutely just learn as we did here. And the first week was characterized by, massive waves, no sleep, seasickness, trying to adapt to a new routine where we rowed 2 hours on and 2 hours off, 24 hours a day. We're trying to consume 7,000 or 8,000 calories a day as well. So your diet's changing, your sleep's changing. You're then rowing at least 12 hours a day on the oars as well. And so it completely obliterates you physically, mentally, emotionally. It's something that's so hard to replicate before you get out there and do it. And so you're finding out what your response is as you go. And I think I had plenty of expectations about what my personal response would be. I thought I'd be someone that would be, I thought we'd mostly really enjoy the challenge and enjoy, the battle. I thought I'd be someone who would be pretty communicative out on the ocean with, people back home, with our supporters, with family, etc. And it became apparent to me pretty quickly that this was going to be just about me containing myself on board this boat, keeping myself healthy, safe, and as positive a mindset as possible. I didn't want to speak to anyone outside of that vessel. And it was a pretty strange realization, something, it's tough when we experience things that are unexpected, and it shocks us. It's very hard to then kind of pull yourself back from that shock. But there was one thing we could do every time, we felt like we were dipping into a negative mindset was that we could get on the oars and we could get ourselves closer to Antigua. And so that's what we focused on, through all of the carnage really of the seas around us and the conditions. We just felt best on the oars, and I think it's a characteristic of ocean rowing. When you are on your rowing shift and you're kind of at the driver, in the driver's seat, I guess essentially, pulling that boat towards Antigua, it really feels great. It feels pretty euphoric actually, and at times you find yourself kind of surfing down waves, and you see your speeds pick up, and everything feels pretty incredible, and the wind's in your hair, and then you turn around and come off your shift and you're sort of left to just rest. You're left to kind of clean up yourself, wipe yourself down, grab some food, fix any mechanical issues, and suddenly you get a bit introspective about sort of what's ahead, potentially months at sea, and you look off onto the horizon, and it feels incredibly overwhelming, and it can be quite, I remember feeling pretty low at points when I wasn't rowing, and so you get this, these big highs and these big lows, and that is life on the ocean. And that first 7 days, that's what we battled. We would just continue to kind of manage those highs and lows as best as we could, stay as sort of balanced in our mindset as possible, but ultimately, focus on what we could, which was, pull on the oars harder than any other crews that were going across the Atlantic.
And were you getting information fed through about where you were in the race?
Yeah, so that's a really important part, is sort of those relatively regular touch points. So every few days we would touch base with the support team, and they would just give us a bit of a lowdown of sort of what was happening with conditions more broadly, where we were in the race. And as I said, that competitiveness was absolutely something that drove us forward. So when we heard we had lost a couple of miles on another crew, it would be motivation. We'd get back on the oars and we'd be really determined to turn that around. When we heard that we had gained some miles on another crew, that also was a huge motivation, back on the oars and sort of we're doing the right thing, and this is really exciting that we're kind of pulling away from the other crews. And so we got to it was day 9 when we had probably the most poignant conversation with the race organisers, and we picked up the phone. They said to us, "You guys are doing incredibly well," which was nice to hear. It didn't feel like that necessarily on board, but they said, "You're doing brilliantly. You are currently leading the pairs race and you're sitting just ahead of the world record pace." Wow. So, a massive boost for us morale-wise, and that had been supported by, fast conditions and big seas, but clearly all of our kind of training and what we were doing on board that boat was paying off. So that felt, pretty special at that point. But as often is the case, at our highest point on this whole journey was pretty much when, everything changed for us.
Right. So tell me, how did everything change?
Yeah. At this point, we just finished that phone call. They had also told us that these conditions would actually start to kind of die down over the next 48 hours. And I think both myself and Chris saw the kind of the finish line of that particular, this particular set of difficult conditions, and that gave us a massive, another massive boost. And so we came off that call. Yeah, we were both on the oars at the time, and it felt, looking back, almost instantly, but it must have been maybe half an hour after we put down the phone, that we experienced something that totally changed our race. And we knew the conditions had been getting worse over kind of each day. We'd seen bigger and bigger waves. We had clocked bigger and bigger speeds down those waves. On this day, we had sort of tripled our maximum speed at one point down a wave. And so, again, another kind of indicator of what the conditions were like. And there was one wave which we spotted on our right-hand side that started building and building and building. And it just didn't break. And we knew that it was a wave different to any other that we had seen in the first 9 days. And we both, as it kind of came towards us, we both dropped the oars. We grabbed hold of our safety lines. And because we knew something pretty drastic was about to happen. And the wave picked us up, turned us in the air, and then slammed us upside down onto the water. And we were obviously powerless to do anything. And we had a huge capsize, which left us underneath the water, obviously scrambling back to try and get ourselves to the surface. And in any kind of ocean faring endeavor, being out at sea, the last thing you want to happen is a capsize. It's known to be probably the most dangerous thing that can happen. And so for us, this was a worst case scenario. And as we were scrambling from underneath the boat, there's a few things that you hope just go your way. The first thing is that you're not knocked unconscious, either by contact with the boat and your head, or just the impact you hit the water with. And this was a massive capsize, but we were lucky to both come up from underneath the boat and emerge at the surface. And I remember coming up, gasping for air, looking across and looking around me, and couldn't quite see Chris. And then a few seconds later, Chris came up, and we were both conscious, which was obviously an important moment. The second thing is that you're still tethered and connected to the boat. And in ocean rowing, because you don't have a sail, because you don't have a motor, if you become separated from your boat out in the ocean, it's incredible how quickly two entities can be pulled apart. And there are several examples over the history of the sport where people just have been separated from their boats and it's just impossible to get them back. And so being tethered at all times to the boat's absolutely vital. So we both sort of pulled on our harnesses and felt that tension and realized we were still connected. And the last thing is that your boat, a specially designed ocean rowing boat, automatically self-rights. And it took maybe 10 seconds as the boat sort of kind of twisted and turned in the water for it to then come back round and be upright. And so we were left sort of hanging onto the side of our boat in the water, looking around at the sort of debris from the deck that was now sort of just around this kind of bomb site in the ocean. And And it's a weird thing to sort of have that moment of capsize, because you've spent the last 9 days looking at the ocean around you for miles into the distance and the horizon, and thinking about the thousands of miles ahead and behind you, wherever it might be. But in a capsize like that, all of our focus was just on the sort of 10 meters around the boat, this like tiny little area really, that we could control, and that we were trying to keep ourselves safe within. And looking at the items that were around in the water at the time, I remember seeing packaged meals and a variety of sort of mechanical bits that were now sort of floating away from the boat. But one thing really caught my eye, and that was a bright yellow device called an EPIRB, which is the emergency beacon that all vessels have at sea, the most important piece of life-saving equipment on board. And it had been kind of ripped from its fitting on the boat, and it was now just bobbing away into the open ocean. And with it, that was our race essentially disappearing, because race rules stipulate that you have to have that item on board for safety reasons. And so we were just watching our race go and disappear. And Chris jumped on board, some quick thinking, and managed to grab one of the oars and tried to sort of hook it in. And it was just a few feet out of that reach. And I had a moment where I thought, do I unclip here and swim after this thing? Because, what was more important to me in this moment? Was it kind of my safety, or was it, getting this EPIRB and keeping our race alive? But I managed to kind of shut that off, and then we sort of were just watching it drift away, and just as we'd sort of given up hope, I remember so clearly just watching it pivot in the water and just start coming back towards me. And it must have traveled 6 or 7 meters in the water right the way back to the boat, right into my outstretched hand. I grabbed hold of it, got back on board, and just sat in front of Chris with an incredibly smug look on my face, feeling like this dream was still alive, essentially.
When you saw it sort of turning in the water, coming back, were you like going, yes, come on?
No,
were you, was there a commentary going?
I was scooping the water towards me, which wasn't really doing anything, but it just felt like, we could drag it back in. And it's such a strange moment, because there's no way it should have drifted back. I don't know why it did, but it to have it back in our hands just felt like we had been on the precipice of this whole dream being crushed, and yet we were kind of raring to go. We felt like we had been through something pretty life threatening, something that very few people have been through, and we had kind of survived it. And at times we were just thinking, wow, what a thing to overcome, and what a part of our story. And now we continue on our way to Antigua.
Great. So you're back on the boat now. Are you about to row again? I mean, what's going on?
Yeah, we're taking a few deep breaths, looking at each other. Heart rates are pretty high. Just checking ourselves for what we lost on board the deck and everything else. And we knew that we kind of wanted to grab the oars and go again. But one thing we needed to do was to speak to the race organisers. When the EPIRB is submerged, it's triggered, and so we knew that they must have had that signal, and so we just wanted to let them know that actually everything was fine. We had a capsize, but we're going to continue. And so to do that, we needed our sat phone locked away in our cabin, in our main cabin. So I turned around to open up the cabin hatch to grab that sat phone, and I was totally engulfed by a massive plume of smoke, really dark smoke, that just completely, swallowed me up, really. And I grabbed the hatch and slammed it shut, and shouted to Chris, fire. And what had happened is, in the impact of the capsize, because it was so huge, our 2 marine batteries that power all of our comms, navigation, and other equipment inside our main cabin had become loose from underneath the deck of that cabin, and they broke free from their fitting, and they had flung across the cabin, split, caught fire, and had now just destroyed kind of all of that equipment. And that whole cabin was a total bomb site. And Chris had had some quick thinking, grabbed hold of the fire extinguisher from the other end of the boat. He passed it to me. I extinguished the flames, and then we slammed that hatch shut. You have to keep the hatches shut at sea, particularly because we'd just been capsized a few seconds later, and if you are capsized with a hatch open, then that boat will not self-right. So that was absolutely something we had to avoid. Shutting that hatch, our whole world had changed. Essentially, we had gone from 2 years of the goal of wanting to get to Antigua, and now our whole kind of goal was to stay safe, and really it was about survival. And for that to change so quickly and so dramatically,
given you survived the rogue wave.
Yeah, exactly. No, totally. And that was, we thought we'd overcome the biggest challenge possible at sea, and very quickly we discovered that we had encountered something that no other person in the race had ever encountered before, which was a fire on board their boat. And so, it's pretty hard looking back to think that we would have been prepared for something like this, because it's something that's never happened before. So, so looking at this situation, we knew our race had completely changed. And I think, pivoting our mindsets at that point was, one of the biggest challenges, was just trying to shift towards this idea of now it's about this moment and us being safe against this next wave. And the long-term thinking of, getting to Antigua was now completely, no longer a feature of our minds. And so as we sort of look to our next, our options really, this is really when also the conditions really turned for the worse. We were seeing waves, up to around 50 feet at this point, really just sort of vertical walls of water just coming towards us, absolutely breathtaking, like nightmarish sized waves. And just everything in those moments just seemed to be deteriorating, on board, around us in the ocean. And it just felt like that like a crazy downward spiral of all these things just suddenly going very, very wrong.
Were you, at this point, were you making good, clean decisions still, or were you starting to deteriorate in your decision making?
I would say there was certainly a panic, an initial panic that set in those moments of just trying to absorb the changes that had gone on around us and on board the boat. And it was, that was, I guess, manifested itself just in, a lot of communicating, kind of over communicating between myself and Chris, just really trying to talk things through and to bounce things off each other. But we quickly were shifting into a mode of just finding the important things to focus on, the things that we could control. And in that moment, really, the primary one was keeping the boat upright. And so as these huge waves were coming towards us, it's worth noting that the cabin that was now, a toxic mix of the fumes from the fire, but also the residue from the fire extinguisher, and then just all the other decimation that really had happened in that capsize. That was our safe space in big seas and big storms. And so that was now uninhabitable. So we had to be out on deck. And we devised a plan that we sort of used our body weight to sort of throw ourselves at the stern cabin of our boat to nudge ourselves over the crest of these waves, almost at a sort of vertical position. And just at every crest of the wave, Chris would throw himself against the cabin, I'd throw myself against Chris, and it was just enough to sort of tip us over that next wave. And then the focus became the next one, in a few seconds' time. And so, that was the main thing that we were just focused on, was keep this boat upright. That helped us feel safe, as safe as possible. Then the other things were, right, so how do we, having just made a call to say we're totally fine, and then 10 seconds later be in a position, well, not a few minutes later really, be in a position where we were the total opposite of that, and we were in desperate need of support. We needed to try and make more contact again, and we triggered our EPIRB. That was the first thing we did. We having actually reset it, we triggered it again on board the boat, and then between waves we would open up the cabin hatch when it was safe to do so, and Chris would rummage around, just stretch a hand in and kind of rummage around and just out of feel try and find maybe a loose sat phone. And maybe after 20 attempts to do that, he managed to grab hold of one, and it had one bar of battery. Managed to make a final call to the race organisers, where we basically told them our scenario and we said, we absolutely need support. They were briefed on what was happening. They could see that we had triggered the EPIRB. They were in contact with the Coast Guard, and then that call ended.
And there was something actually quite important about that call as well. I remember when we spoke before, you pleaded with them not to tell your families.
Absolutely, yeah.
Talk me through
you're
that.
Absolutely right. That call was, in my mind, on the surface, it's remembered as our emergency call. But the thing that was most prominent in our minds throughout that call was much more for us, it was really about, what are you going to tell our families? And we are now in the middle of a crisis in the Atlantic, and we couldn't bear the thought of them being told that this had happened until we had a resolution, until we were safe. But race rules are, again, that you have an emergency contact. They have to be told when these rescues are being coordinated, and a Mayday distress signal has been sent out. And so we did plead with them. We said to them, we're going to keep ourselves as safe as we can on board this boat, but we do not want you saying anything to our families until this is done. And sadly, they for us anyway, they of course have to stick to their rules. We signed off on them, and that was one of the toughest parts. One of the toughest parts was we had no idea what was ahead, how long we were going to be out there, who, what, when, or if someone was going to be able to rescue us, and that trying to navigate that along with the emotions of just thinking about what our families are about to be told and what they were going to deal with, sat at home waiting for news, was pretty devastating. And it was just another one of these these connection points between everything you have to deal with on board this boat, but then everything you're sort of connected to back home. And so navigating the next moments with both those factors was a big challenge.
So you and Chris are throwing yourselves up against the stern side of the boat every way to try and tip you over the top. How long is this going on for? And is this daylight? Where are we in terms of time?
We're right in the sort of middle of the day.
Right.
And so we can see the waves. The conditions were relatively kind of the weather conditions were relatively clear. It was just the most incredibly huge seas. And so, being able to see those waves enabled us to get over the next one. And we did that kind of relentlessly throughout the rest of the day. So for hours and hours and hours, right the way through till the sun started to go down and light started to fade. And that was when, again, it was a real sort of moment of change that we had to navigate, because we started to really struggle to see when those waves were approaching. It was a very dark evening and quickly turned to night, and we knew we needed a different plan. There was a couple of waves that hit us and sort of kind of swept us over the side of the boat, and we're both sort of trying to keep ourselves safe, keep ourselves on board, but realizing it's going to be harder and harder. And it felt like waves were coming from both sides, and everything just became incredibly hectic without any vision of what was coming. So Chris suggested we basically get ourselves in the storage cabin, and I remember as soon as he mentioned it, I almost was just like, there's just nothing that will get me in that cabin. The thought of being locked in a cabin that small, it's about the size of a large suitcase. So to get one of us in there would be a tight squeeze, but two would have been just horrific. And for a few moments, I did sort of push back against that, and I think it was just one more wave that sort of came out of nowhere and hit us, on the deck. That we both looked at each other and knew that was our only option. And it was this strange thing where we sort of were relinquishing the proactive battle that we had been having out on deck that felt like we had some control. And in its place, it was now just sort of stillness and just completely, allowing the ocean to sort of dictate our fate a little bit. And we emptied out the cabin, we got inside, we slammed the hatch door shut behind us, and we were just in this completely locked fetal position next to each other inside that cabin. And we were at the mercy of the sea, as I said, for another 6 or 7 hours throughout the night. And that was probably worse, for me, being inside that cabin. We sort of, looking back, suggested, is that what it's like to be in a submarine during the war? It felt like we were being hit by missiles, and within that the hull of that boat, you can hear these waves coming towards you. It's this really weird thing. I'm not sure why it's the case, but you can hear they start as a very faint whistling sound, and it gets louder and louder and louder into this massive roar. And then there's just this huge impact on the boat, and we sort of brace ourselves, and the boat twists and turns. And because we're so tightly confined to that space, we don't know sometimes if we're upside down or the right way up. It's just incredibly disorientating. I remember having to kind of really focus to work out, whether we were capsized or not. And
not to mention, you must be exhausted.
Yeah, totally. We were exhausted from all that time out on deck fighting the waves, and even so much so that there were moments when both of us sort of passed out for a few minutes, and then would sort of come to. And to think that all that adrenaline was pumping through us, but we were still just that exhausted that we were drifting off, every sort of, few minutes, we'd kind of lose our consciousness. And it was just a horrendous period of this whole experience where, we would look out of the window and just hope at some point that we might, see something on the horizon. And one of the things that we did do, again, just the only thing we could do really from within that cabin, was we had a really powerful laser in one of our sort of survival bags inside that cabin. And as soon as we got hit by a wave, we sort of thought that would buy us maybe 5 to 10 seconds of time. And so as soon as the wave hit, the boat stabilized, Chris would open up the cabin hatch, and I would put my hand out with the laser, shine it 360 degrees around the horizon, hoping to just catch someone who might be out there. And then I'd whip my hand back in, and Chris would shut it just before the next wave. And we had a few moments where actually a wave just hit a bit early and just caught us with the open hatch. Water would flood into the cabin. Chris did a great job to just a couple of times just slam it shut and actually stop that water coming in. But it was something that we felt like may move the dial on getting us noticed, and hopefully would support us in being found and rescued.
So you don't know if anyone's coming. You're in a really critical situation. You're out of control, basically. You're at the mercy of the ocean. What happened next?
Yeah, at this point we were pretty desperate to see something, and the only light we could see was we had our navigation light at the other end of the boat, which we had kept on, again for hopefully some visibility from other vessels. But it was the early hours of the next morning where we spotted a flicker of a light across an incredibly dark sky and ocean, right on the horizon, a tiny little flicker, and we hadn't really seen another light for 9 days, so we knew that this was potentially our rescuers. So this light got brighter and brighter, and I remember at that point, as soon as we kind of really clocked that it was coming towards us, I looked at Chris, and we both shared, we exchanged a smile, a big sigh of relief, and it was, we honestly thought that this whole thing was going to be over, and we'd sort of been through the worst, and we were going to. This vessel was going to come alongside us, roll out the red carpet. We were going to step on, and we were going to be taken care of. What we didn't know was things were about to get a whole lot worse, and that was because this vessel that was coming towards us, that we had no comms with, no real visibility of. But as it got bigger and bigger, we stepped out onto deck and saw what was a 250 meter, 100,000 ton oil tanker powering towards us at 6 knots. And our expectations of the rescue against what we were now facing, the gap in that was pretty staggering. And now we knew that this was going to be the biggest challenge that we had ever faced, getting ourselves on board the deck of that tanker.
How many meters long is your rowing vessel?
It's 7 meters.
Right, and this is a 250 meter oil tanker.
Yeah, it's a huge difference. I mean, we're a speck in the ocean compared to this vessel, and actually, the crew. It was a miracle they saw us at all. They had a particular area that they were scanning with our EPIRB signal. But in those seas, with the size of our boat, obviously in the middle of the night, that was a miracle in itself that we were even spotted. And so they had to move at 6 knots because of the size of those waves. And it was the only vessel within hundreds of miles that was capable of even trying and attempting a rescue in these conditions. Every other boat was fighting out there. Every other vessel on the ocean in that area was fighting these conditions. So the tanker had travelled a long way off course, and it was now coming towards us. And it's a 20-meter a hull wall essentially that this vessel has to the deck. From the sea level. And so, that in itself feels kind of impossible to scale. And as it came towards us, it kind of struck us head on to get as close as possible. But really, it was a few feet away from just crushing our boat. And then it sort of powered past us, and we were just sliding down the side of the tanker. And above us, we could see sort of shoulders and heads of figures kind of looking over the top of the deck down the side of the boat, shouting down. But again, the howling winds, you just can't hear anything. You've got the roar of the tanker, the howling winds, the waves on one side. And I've often described the sea and these huge waves kind of smashing us into the tanker, and the tanker, which started this big pitching motion and has its own currents around it as well. This is also kind of throwing us back towards the sea. And so it's the sort of unstoppable force, immovable object, myself and Chris just sandwiched between the two. And as we sort of were pulled down the side of this tanker, we could see they'd thrown a rope and a ladder over the side of the tanker, and neither are accessible in the conditions. It was too high, and we just didn't have the opportunity to grab hold of either. And so very quickly we found ourselves at the back of the tanker, and clearly there was a lot of chaos on board the deck. The crew were now running down to kind of follow us down the side of the boat, and obviously at the back of the tanker you get the curvature of the hull in towards the propeller. Now the propeller was off, which is standard in a rescue, but because of that curvature, we felt ourselves start to be dragged underneath the tanker. And this was obviously that critical moment where you're looking at each other, and you've sort of got that subconscious communication where you're going to have to separate yourself from your boat. You're going to be unclipping for the first time really in 9 days. It's something you never do in ocean rowing, but this is one example where it's absolutely critical that we did. And Chris was near the end of the rope, which had a buoy on the end, and so he unclipped and managed to loop his harness around a buoy and then clip it back onto himself, and then he grabbed hold of the rope and swung off. And so he was sort of hanging on the side of the tanker by this rope. A few seconds later, I knew my option was standing by the ladder, but it was a few feet above me, and so just at full stretch, I could grab hold of sort of the bottom plank with one hand either side, really as far as I could stretch, and ended up sort of swinging off the ladder, and now just hanging there next to Chris on the side of the tanker. And I remember sort of looking back over my shoulder and just seeing a few seconds later our boat get ripped underneath the tanker, and that was the last time our boat was ever seen or ever sent a signal. And so validation really for us that we had released ourselves from that boat, but we were obviously in an incredibly precarious position just hanging on the side of the tanker, and it became pretty apparent that they weren't able to pull us up, and we just hang there for minutes really. So I think it was a couple of minutes that we were both hanging on, and it's pretty much as long as we possibly could. And
there's footage of this, isn't there?
There's some incredible footage from the guys that were obviously managing the bridge of the tanker at the time and the navigation. They have some pretty startling footage of us in these moments, and hanging on the side of the tanker, I knew my grip was going to go pretty soon, coming to the end of 2 minutes hanging on. Chris, I then saw Chris fall next to me. I didn't know this at the time, but he had grabbed hold as a last-ditch attempt to hold on. He grabbed hold with his teeth and had a load of teeth sort of wrenched from his mouth as he fell. But he was, obviously pretty happy to feel
tethered.
the tension of his harness just kind of hold him just above the water. So he was now hanging there from his harness. And then a few seconds later, I felt my grip go. But I wasn't connected to anything, just felt myself fall straight, 5 or 6 meters straight into the ocean below. And yeah, in those moments, you obviously contemplate, how it's got to this point. This was, something that we never thought would have been possible, really, at the start of, this challenge. And I certainly think as well, Chris has, his own perspective as someone watching his friend fall into the ocean, and really at that point, just no hope of possibly getting back. And I came out from the water and just have this image just imprinted on my mind of the tanker and Chris just powering away from me, and with it just all hope of surviving kind of diminishing. And obviously it's incredible the instincts and the survival determination to just do something in those scenarios. And for me, I mentioned, the early morning swim lessons that my parents took me to, quite literally an important part of these next moments, because I came straight out of the water and just started trying to swim towards the direction where the tanker was going, and hoping that would, give me a sort of final lifeline. And I probably maybe did a dozen strokes, certainly not swimming at 6 knots, which so the tanker, drifting away from me. And I was just about to kind of give up, essentially. And it was at that moment I noticed something on my right hand side, and the only light in this totally black water was the reflection from the bridge's lights onto the water in front of me on my right hand side. And there was this really clear black line just cutting straight through that reflection, and it was immediately recognizable as a rope, the way it was moving through the water. And I darted across to my right hand side and managed to just grab hold of the last sort of couple of feet, really, of this rope. Held on and was now being dragged behind the tanker at 6 knots. Unable really to do anything other than just hold on for my life. And in those next few moments, one of the crew then spotted I was reconnected, and so they now started to try and pull that rope back towards the ladder. And the rope was essentially let out before the rescue as sort of a final lifeline for in the event that the rescue did get to this point. And so now they were able to sort of pull me back towards where the ladder was. They had lowered the ladder a little bit further, and so second by second, meter by meter, I felt myself getting closer back to that ladder. And I knew I was just going to face a single final attempt to sort of get myself connected to this vessel. And I saw how the waves were coming high on the tanker, and then the pitching motion of the tanker was kind of moving from side to side. And so it meant that the ladder would be submerged for a few seconds in the water, and then it would be ripped 6, 7, 8 meters out the water and be totally out of reach. And it was such a violent sort of movement that I just knew I would have a matter of seconds when the ladder was in the water for me to really get myself across. And so I took a deep breath when I was close enough, and I sort of let go of that ladder, of the rope, threw myself across to the ladder, and knew my grip was gone. I had to get my legs in, and so I hooked my legs into the bottom plank of the ladder, got to about my calves, and was just sort of hanging back in the water, trying to pull myself in, and just knew that if I was about to be ripped out, I was just going to fall straight back, and it would, I would be lost to the sea. And I just got an extra bit of energy, and about a foot of water that just came from underneath me and just propped me up into this ladder. I managed to pull myself in and just ended up sitting on this ladder like you would be sitting on a swing. And yeah, I always said our perspectives were so warped at that stage that as soon as I sat into that position, I felt safe. Sitting on a swing is a safe thing for anyone. It's in this context, it wasn't, but it felt safe in that moment, and particularly from where I was a few seconds earlier. So it was in that moment that I thought that I actually might survive this. And I remember screaming to the guys that were pulling up Chris to pull him up. Chris was shouting to them to pull me up. And then slowly, side by side, we were pulled up and dragged onto the tanker, and yeah, we were safe.
I'm sorry, I'm exhausted. I mean, I am literally exhausted, Max. I have heard this story before, and every time I hear it, I feel like I am physically there. I mean, it's just incredible. I mean, I literally, yeah. So, just take a breath. So you're now on the tanker with a crew you don't know, going somewhere you don't know. I mean, are you physically okay? I mean, mentally, I'm sure you're shot to pieces, but are you both physically okay? I mean, Chris has lost half his teeth. What's going on now?
Yeah, incredibly, I was physically, I was absolutely fine. And Chris, as you say, yeah, I remember we were laid flat on the floor of a room, but we were carried into a room, actually. Neither of us could really walk. We were laid flat on a floor of one of their cabins. We had 30 guys from the ship sort of just standing around us, looming over us. I looked at Chris and just obviously a bloodied mouth and look of shock, likewise mine. Sort of we just exchanged glances more than anything. But we were okay. We were okay physically. And we immediately asked, can you get us? We're saying, we need to get home. Can you get us back to the Canaries? We want to get back to our families, etc. And that was when they delivered the news that we were going to be on board this vessel for as long as it took to get to their next destination, which happened to be Brazil. So that was a bit of a shock to hear. First thing that you get on board this tanker. So we were sort of processing that.
Was there a doctor aboard?
They said the doctor was going to come and give us a sort of a green light on our physical state. I think we were both lying on the floor thinking, I'm sure there's something wrong with us. Heart rates were through the roof and feeling, really in shock. And so, I think the doctor was ultimately the one of the engine room mechanics, but he came in and sort of just looked at us, had a cigarette hanging out of his mouth and just sort of gave us 2 thumbs up and just said, "You're okay." It was basically the doctor's consultation on our condition. So but we were physically we were okay.
And were you able to phone home, or what was the?
Yeah, so we they gave us, we didn't have any clothes on, so they gave us some hand-me-downs to just chuck on, and the first thing we did was we took a sat phone from the crew, and I went out on deck and made a call to my family, and to just call my parents' phone number, and was so aware that they had spent a lot, however many hours, in this horrific waiting game, really. And so I as soon as I heard their voices, I just said sorry. I said sorry about 100 times. Didn't really say anything else, and they just said it's okay. They said it's okay, and I don't need to say that. But yeah, it was a tough moment to have to sort of just speak to them. But it was also I felt very lucky to be able to.
So how long were you aboard the tanker to Brazil before you got home?
Yeah, so it's 3 weeks on board the oil tanker to Brazil. Incredibly difficult period because it was where all the bad stuff happened. It wasn't a place that we could process what had happened, really. We didn't know when we were going to get off. Initially, we were supposed to be in Brazil within sort of 4 days. That became 7 days. That then went to 10 days. It then went to 2 weeks. It was the scheduling of the shipping, which just meant that there was a chance that it wouldn't even be Brazil. We may get close to Brazil and they may be asked to be somewhere else pretty quickly. So it was this really horrible sort of unknown about when we would get off. 3 weeks later in Brazil, it was incredible feeling to be sort of, to get onto land, ferried through, airports, and we did have a grab bag of stuff that had our 2 passports in, $100 emergency cash, which we importantly spent on 2 neck cushions. We felt like that was a worthwhile spend at that point. No upgrades on our flights, regardless. We tried to tell them, but no upgrades. But we eventually, after a couple of connections, managed to make it back to the UK.
Wow, as I say, an unbelievable story. I suppose the question now is, having gone through all that, why on earth would you want to go and try again?
Yeah, there's, the word want is, there's a sense in that, if, to say you want to do something, is different to feeling like you need to do something. And I was, I'm pretty clear that I felt like I needed to. To give you an idea of my mindset, actually, I on the second, the day after we were rescued, I wrote down with a pen and paper all the things I would do differently and all the things I would do the same if I ever went back and did that, that challenge again. And so there was something in my mind that was even telling me then, fresh off the experience, that that would be useful information in my future.
What was Chris thinking when you were doing this?
You know what, Chris was a part of sort of helping me devise that. I think I got the pen and paper and started writing these things down, and we sort of just bounced a few things off each other, and so I wouldn't say that we were necessarily aligned on sort of our kind of feelings and emotions about the race at that point, but it was just interesting to sort of debrief.
Yes, I was going to say, this is a debrief,
it was like this cathartic sense of sort of like, what if we could go back? What if we could go back 9 days? What would we have done differently? What, all these things. And so it was that sort of context. But I think in my mind, I knew that was stuff that may be tools for the future. And so, look, I battled every day the feeling of, do I or don't I go back to the Atlantic? And you're also just existing in a new world as a new person who's been through something very unique, and you're having conversations with people that are sharing their thoughts about your experience. And often we were told by those that that care about us and wanted to support us, you've been through something more challenging than you would have been through if you'd just crossed the Atlantic successfully. Getting through what you got through was a much bigger challenge. And so, and I appreciated every person that said that, and I understood what they were trying to help with by saying that. But for me, I kind of wanted to not hear that anymore. And there was such a number of factors at play, but I felt like this was going to be the biggest decision of my life. I felt like it would define every decision I ever took in my life again. That, if I could find a positive step, however I defined that, then every other decision in my life would be an easier one than this. This was going to be the toughest thing I'd ever done.
And would you say that's true?
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely
Since
true.
then. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so to try and get myself into a position to make a good decision, time was needed. So, I did spend a few months trying to go back and forth on what the processing of this experience was. And I think that obviously I was trying to battle the sense of disappointment. Early on, it was disappointment. It was a sense of failure. I actually felt pretty hard done by. I felt like, how did something totally outside of our control actually bring me to end this dream and this goal that we had, and how unfair that was. And those were kind of my emotions. I think it was sort of a I just felt really bad about it in general, and just felt like it was not something I was really looking at myself in the mirror about. It was sort of, I was looking elsewhere and just saying, there's these external forces that cause this.
And yet that was a stronger way of rationalising what had happened than remembering all those horrendous moments where you were literally nearly going to die.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it was. The predominant feeling was of not achieving the goal. It wasn't of I guess the negative impact of the actual kind of the traumatic experience of the rescue. It was just that we hadn't reached Antigua, and so that was what I was trying to find. I was trying to see if that ever went away or ever dwindled, that sense of disappointment and wanting to turn that around. And I think that ultimately, I could not shift that feeling. I could not get rid of this ambition. And I started to turn that disappointment, that sense of failure in my mind into much more into what are the silver linings here? What are the opportunities here? And, if there was value, I thought to myself, if there was value for me going on and taking this challenge, as an individual and in my life, then the value of going back is an opportunity that's tenfold the original. Yeah, absolutely increased. And so, it was hard to resist the feeling that would be even more defining of my life. And I think that's what I was I wanted to rewrite my narrative. I didn't want to be defined by the worst case scenario. I ultimately wanted to write a story and of my life, and I felt like I had control. And when we spoke about instincts earlier, that's from that first day on board the tanker when we were rescued, I knew deep down that I was going to have to go back, and it was just a case of getting to a point where I could fully commit to that once I'd sort of been through the processing. And it was probably about 6 months later that everything in my mind got confirmed that was exactly what I was going to do.
Now, Max, I'm going to have to ask this question as a mother. How on earth did that go down with your mum? Yeah,
no, it's a very fair question. She did incredibly well with me delivering that news. Look, I think I can't shy away from the fact that she was the most impacted person by everything that happened, and no mum should really have to go through in their lives what she sort of faced in those moments that we were out there fighting, and the thought of losing a son and a child, I think is something which I wish she'd never had to feel, and so the thought of going back, absolutely, that was one of the most prominent things in my mind, that I would have to deliver that news to her and I would have to help her through that. Ironically, she's the best mum in the world, so she was ultimately going to help me in achieving my goal. And but I think those early conversations, it ultimately was a conversation with both my mum and my dad. They needed to sit me down and just say a few things to me and get their points across. And so I remember a conversation, the hardest conversation I've ever had to have with them, which was when I'd said to them, I'm going to go back and do it again. We then sat down in the living room of our family home, and they both just said to me, do you know, looked me in the eye, and they just said, do you know that if you go back, you can die, is what they said. And I essentially asking me to accept that and to acknowledge that directly to them as their son. And I did do both those things. I did acknowledge them, their point, and I accepted that. And I, as soon as we had that conversation, as tough as it was, we sort of came out of that room a team again, in the feeling of like, well, we know that we can see that this is what you need to do, and as much as we don't want you to, we understand that you're going to do it, and we'll support you in that. And I was incredibly lucky to have them both and all my family in that support.
And just kind of rounding off the story, it seems ridiculous to round it off because it's such a success in the end, but there's a lovely piece of synchronicity here, isn't there, with your partner, your rowing partner, on that second attempt?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I did go and ask Chris, and the thing about these challenges is, as I said, it's years of commitment, it's years of sacrifice, and particularly in the way it ended, we'd already been through a lifetime's worth of experiences and highs and lows together, myself and Chris. And by this point, for Chris, his life was, accelerating. He had things that were incredibly important in his life and that he absolutely needed to prioritize. And so it wasn't right for him to be able to go back with me, even though I asked him. And it just so happened that Dave Spellman had finished his sort of rugby career and was looking for his next challenge. And incredibly, I told him some of this story, and he said he wanted to come back and do it with me. And so credit to him. And we had that certainly a sort of full circle moment where we agreed to commit to go back and take it on again, and we made the start line of the race exactly 2 years later in December 2019.
And what was the outcome of that?
The outcome of that was no fires on board our boat, which was an important part of our success. But look, we successfully rode the Atlantic 3,000 miles. And then we had incredible bonuses of the fact that we won the race for the pairs race. And we ended up in a bit of a sprint finish across the last sort of 10 days. It's pretty wild to call 10 days a sprint finish, but we had to give everything to cross the finish line with a new world record, breaking the previous fastest time for rowing the Atlantic by 14 minutes, which
That's
is
ridiculous.
Yeah.
How many days at sea?
37 days.
And you broke the world record.
14 minutes. Yeah. And I was recently became aware of the fact that if you put that into a 100-meter sprint race, take the Olympic 100-meter final, it would be a winning margin of 2 centimeters across two of the best Olympic athletes on the planet, or 0.002 seconds. I mean, it's infinitesimally small margins, and thank God we were the right side of that record.
And when you got off that boat that second time, to your family who were waiting for you in Antigua, how did that feel?
Yeah, very, very special, very special. And the first big hug that I had was with my mum, which was incredibly special. And there was a lot more in that hug than just a hug. There's a lot of healing that was sort of being done, and it's something that I think a moment that again actually shifted her mindset for the positive as well, and where she was at mentally. And I think that's certainly without doubt, one of the things I'm most proud of with this whole journey was being able to turn it around for her, so it's something that she can speak about in a positive light now, and for the rest of those that were supporting me and my family. It's turned an incredibly negative, really horrific situation into something which brings quite a lot of joy to them as well.
And my final question to you, Max, is unbelievable story, unbelievable experience that you've had. What has that taught you about you?
It's taught me a number of things. I think prominently, it's confirmed everything that I feel in that internal compass. It's something that I will always listen to. The instincts of how my body really reacts when I hear about something, or I'm chasing something, or something happens to me. That is, I'm fully committed that is the best possible guide for people in life, and would compel as many people as possible to follow that instinct when they feel it. I think that's probably the most powerful thing I took from my experience.
Max, thank you so much for sharing a story of determination and strength. And you're just somebody that does not want to be defined by failure. I can see that. And that resilience that sits at your core, that, as you just said, comes from this kind of great guiding instinct, is something that you live by and make your decisions by. It is incredible. And for our viewers watching and our listeners, you can sense that sitting next to Max. It's kind of like an energy. It's quite incredible. But On behalf of everyone who's been listening and watching, thank you to our brilliant mind today, Max Thorpe. And if you want to know more about Max and his achievements, please do have a look at the Harvey Thorneycroft website, or actually, in an old-fashioned way, give Harvey or me a call and we can talk to you about Max all day long. He's an incredible guy. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.